This is Make Planning Make Sense. I'm Aaron Zimmerman and I'm a director at Centro. Our guest this week is Maurice Lange of the Centre for Cities. Listeners of the pod will know that we're fans of the research published by the Centre for Cities, and the conversation with Maurice is brilliant in that it highlights specific actions for reform, embraces the complexity of the problems, and avoids passing individual responsibility for reform onto the unaccountable collective. Please be sure to give the podcast a follow on your preferred platform, recommend a favorite episode or two within your professional network, and continue the conversation on our media channels, MPMS Podcast, on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. Here is our conversation with Maurice Lange. Maurice Lange, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
We always like to start off with a bit about who you are and how you came to your role.
Yes, so I'm Maurice. I work for the Centre for Cities. We're one of the UK's leading think tanks on all things urban economics. So we tackle issues with housing, transport, local governance, devolution. I've been at the Centre for a couple of years. Before that, I worked in politics and other research jobs, became really interested in local government and how it functioned and how it interacted with housing and how houses get built. I don't have a planning background. I did a master's after working in politics in economic geography and did a few planning courses on the side. But really sort of the interest in planning has only developed the more and more it seemed like the explanation for the problem I was trying to solve, which is the sort of housing crisis more generally.
Word. I mean, we're really excited to have you on the podcast because we read the reports from Centre for Cities, and that certainly includes your reports with a lot of sort of excitement. You know, I think sometimes we're reading them and we're like, thank you. Thank you, somebody, for saying this. So we're really pleased to have you on.
One of the reports that I have cited a lot on this podcast is the Planorama report comparing the UK planning system to other planning systems around the world. The report starts off talking about dwellings per capita, and we've kind of flatlined with dwellings per capita in the UK, whereas Germany, France, Japan, they've increased. What's the significance of dwellings per capita?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question because I think that frames some of the conversation about whether or not what we say in the report is super meaningful and really important for the housing crisis or not. So dwellings per capita is a very rough measure of how well a system is doing at delivering houses. But dwellings per capita, you'd expect to increase as a country gets richer. You've got fewer families living with 3 families in one house, for example. And because of how poor people were in the past, lots of people were doing that. They're not doing that anymore. That evolves over time. And then also as countries get richer and older, you expect people to be more living in more single households, meaning that you'd expect more units per person. So people aren't living with 5, 8 people in one house. They're living on an average of 2, 3. And if you think about what's going on in the UK, is if you've got flat dwellings per capita, but you've also got more old people entering into those single homes, you've either got to find a way of moving those old people out of those family homes, which is difficult for as long as we don't have an effective social care system. What do you do from the age of 70 to 80 when you don't need care? Where are you? So I think there's a strong argument that if there's one type of supply of home we need more, is that kind of home to free up some of those family houses. You can also incentivize people to move with different types of taxes or whatever. But at a broader kind of brush, sort of higher level, you expect quite a lot of old people to stay where they're living until they die or until very late in their life. And you also don't expect people to move large distances across the country as they're aging. So dwellings per capita going up as your society ages and as fewer people get married as well. And I think some of the poor housing outcomes you're seeing for people in the UK is because we haven't seen it go up in the same way that you've seen in other countries.
We've talked before on the podcast about how some planning policies have a little bit of a presumption in favor of fair to say, heteronormative nuclear family sort of typology. And I wonder how much that might factor into it as well. So as society becomes more open and accommodating for households of different types beyond the nuclear typology.
Yeah, it's interesting. You have a perception that because families are struggling to find homes, the thing that you most need to build is more family homes, where actually, especially within cities, you're finding families finding it difficult to move into family homes because those family homes are occupied by people like me who lives with young professionals living in a shared house. And of course, on 4 salaries, we can outbid a couple who are trying to raise a family. Rather than building family homes, you can make effective use of space in cities by building 1 or 2 beds, which would then see me being more likely to live in a 1 or a 2 bed. Oh, I love my housemates a lot, but and I'm kind of glad to have had to wrangle with this thing, but it's not good for families.
And what's the relationship between dwellings per person and affordability?
I mean, it's a complicated one because affordability is affected by all sorts of things and it can be measured in lots of different ways. By some measurements, Germany is pretty unaffordable, but that's because it has a higher proportion of renters than it does homeowners. How you square those things as affordable or not in a life course is all complicated. But broadly, we expect supply and demand to operate in the housing market. Your average home is going to be cheaper if you have more homes and more choice. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that adding supply in this particular location is going to make this particular location more affordable, because housing markets don't work on a kind of single field basis. They are determined by economic geography, which is complicated, and you have relationships between different cities and different parts of cities, etc. Adding houses in one part of the country could actually be better for affordability in a completely different bit of the country. But if you're taking it at a national level or at a city-wide level, more supply, holding other things constant, is going to be better for affordability.
Yeah. So we're saying that Germany, France, Japan, ratio of dwellings per person has increased steadily, whereas our UK dwellings per person ratio has kind of remained a bit stagnant, right?
Yeah.
What could it be about our UK context that might be contributing to that?
Yeah, I mean, the Planorama paper tries to synthesize 4 different categories of thing which all interrelate with each other to explain that difference in trend. And it started off with me asking the researcher that worked with me on the paper, Luca, I think we can write a quick briefing that says other countries have planning rules, they have land rules, they have a more structured system of hierarchical planning, and they have better incentivized local government. That's easy. We can write that on 10 pages. And then obviously the more you get into it, the more it's slightly more complicated in every angle, and you need to explain yourself and compare it to the UK in a detailed way. And so we end up with a 40-page report plus 20 pages of appendices. But to get into it, those 4 things are the things that we think are important. So you have local level planning is very different in those 3 countries to what it is in the UK. Broadly, they have rules-based spatial planning, which means you have a zone for any given bit of land, and that zone describes what is or is not allowed to be built on that bit of land. Those zones can be very conservative, they can be very basic in terms of what they describe, or they can be quite detailed and quite positive. So it could say, at the moment, you're allowed to build anything up to 6 stories, and if the average house is 3 stories, that is it's an up zone, I suppose, is what you would say. And where you have a zoning system, every bit of land is covered by this, and you can manage your housing supply through changing your zone and putting different zones in different places. And that's the way the local plan operates. And you review that on a periodic basis. There are abilities for, if you're a developer and you want a moderation to a zone, you can come in and say, hey, can we change this? And then it's discretionary, like the UK system, for them to decide whether or not you do. But by and large, it's this sort of more, I think it characterizes the state as a more like proactive actor.
Ding, 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 ding.
So, and then the UK system, by comparison, it leaves most decision making for after the point of application. So your local plans aren't as descriptive and they're not as specific. Mm-hmm. They don't have rules. They have guidance in the form of policies broadly. Obviously, you have allocated sites which have a bit more information, but even compared to what a zone would confer in terms of certainty and guidance and rules, allocated sites don't, you can find an allocated site which doesn't even say this number of homes is allowable or not.
They left a lot of the work for people like us.
Yeah, you have jobs because of the UK system. It's true. You might be a public planner in France. And so that makes a real difference for who can play in the planning system because of the amount of risk that you take on as the actor, as the person who wants to develop. And I think this affects both public and private and third party, for profit, for not profit.
Yeah.
It loads up risk. I've spoken to local authorities or housing associations who are not for profit entities, but they find navigating their own planning system very challenging. So yeah, the way we try and characterize it in the paper is by saying discretion exists in all systems. So I think other colleagues, for different reasons, have characterized other international planning systems as zoning systems and ours as discretionary. And the point that sort of I was trying to make in this paper is actually there's loads of discretion being exercised in other countries.
Thank
it's just
you.
Where is that discretion being exercised?
Yeah.
And then that means, what do planners spend their time working on? Do they spend their time, what is the right thing to do in this place in a proactive manner, or do they spend their time receiving ideas and then making judgments on those ideas and having every single idea go through a process of political scrutiny? Or has that political scrutiny been moved upstream? I mean, it doesn't mean that you don't have anti-development processes, and it doesn't mean that those sort of case-by-case sort of protest isn't invalid in other countries and that there aren't ways to stop development if a plan says yes. But most things are more risk-free, meaning that smaller businesses can take a risk and exist and aren't as so likely to go under in a time of hardship as they are in the UK.
How do you see London's typology at the moment, and if the planning system had more in principle parameters upfront?
Yeah,
But, yeah.
I think that's really interesting. So like we've just published what is in some ways a follow-up paper to the Panorama paper, which is looking at housing density in the UK, France and Japan. I think what you're talking about there is like sort of like density inertia, and how radical or not a given planning policy would need to be to change the density of a place. Because if you've already got, let's say, Berlin, I don't know, and it's got 5-6 stories as its kind of prevailing height, any infill is going to be up to that, and that's actually going to be quite a lot of houses. Whereas if you're starting from the baseline of Birmingham and 90% of houses are 2 stories, then infill there looks like adding 2 stories, and that means for any given piece of land you're much more like you're unlikely to break from the norm. And so when you're thinking about density and that sort of urban change, and you're trying to think about where should we be given some sort of very basic principles around the way urban economics should work, given sort of the size of a labour market and the location with proximity to jobs, i.e. the city centre, and go, okay, so near a city centre it should be taller, bigger cities should be taller. This is what we see as an international trend. We identify anywhere where the UK breaks from this international trend is okay, maybe we need to do more than just allowing infill in the existing form. We need to do something to break that. And that then comes in the form of a rule which says anything up to height of 4 or 5 stories, and then that increases where we are on your baseline. Whereas if you're in like a medium-sized city in the UK, and your average housing density is not that different to a medium-sized city in France, there's not much of an economic indication, save for the idea that actually French cities are also held back for some reason. London is where Manchester, Birmingham and Leeds need to get to, in the sense that it has this weird mixed typology of Victorian terraces of 2 or 3 stories in different places, sometimes 4, and then interspersed with whatever in the 30 years after the World War got built in the gaps. And some of those really tall and some of them are really short, and like you have some 2-story houses that were built in the 1970s in Zone 1, and you have some towers built in Zone 6 that were also built at the same, 10 years before. Anyway, so London's very strange, and other cities need to get to a point where there's more sort of mix of typologies. Our big cities outside London are just overwhelmingly houses, and some of the movement towards a mixed typology can happen on new brownfield development. If you go to any of those cities now, they look like that, but they're propping up. But also they need to find a way of flipping houses which are already houses and having a planning system which facilitates the recycling of already developed residential areas. And that's the challenge for London, is going, okay, we've got a diminishing pot of brownfield land that it hasn't already got some houses on it. Now we need to make it much easier for our system to allow a developer, public or private, to come and buy 1, 2 or 3 houses in a row and knock it down and build something taller. That's the way that density is going to have to change in London. In the paper, we write about Croydon and its supplementary planning document that it had in place from 2018 to 2021. RIP. Indeed, yeah, indeed. So for those listeners who haven't read it, it was responding to a similar proposal in a draft version of the 2017 London Plan, which was going to require local authorities to publish similar documents to manage suburban intensification. And so it comes up with a set of rules about what you are or are not allowed to do in terms of intensification in Croydon. But reading between the lines, it's kind of permitting one main type of incremental development, which is a larger detached plot that you then buy, you demolish that detached house and you build a small block of flats between sort of 8 and 16 units on it. And then they draw a set of rules which involve heights. It wasn't ambitious at all. It was only 3 stories were allowed. And then overlooking requirements, they've got angles and they have some stuff on materials, but that stuff is more sort of varied. And then they say, if you meet these, you can get permission. And what they see is a tripling of that type of development happening incredibly quickly because people knew it was going to happen. It's not a big risk to take on such a small development. The developers which are operating the area are able to upscale quickly or come in. I did some maths trying to look at, I counted all of the potential plots, looking at all of the houses of a particular age and not age, particular sort of plot size, and going, okay, so there are thousands of potential plots. How many did we see actually flip in this period per year? And it's something one in every 350 flips per year. So it would take 300 years for Croydon to delete all of its detached houses and replace them with this new type of typology. And in so doing, every time you flip one, you gain 10 houses at least. And so that gives you a sense of the slowness in some way, but also how little you need to happen in an area for it to be perceived as a political problem, because then this became a political football, which was then removed by an incoming mayor who ran on a ticket against it. So, and I think that's part of we do have these systems by which you can introduce rules in the British system. And the problem with the British system is that they're not mandatory. And I'm quite hopeful that we'll see something in the new London plan that is bolder and nearer to what the 2017 draft was proposing. So in the paper on density, we do a little bit of a trailer on the Croydon stuff, but I'll be putting out a piece of work in the next couple of months going more in depth on that and going, okay, if we do some more complicated modelling, like countries which actually do have zoning, and we think we could introduce zoning here, how can we think about how much housing we might expect on those types of places if the London plan is bold? Anyway.
And then we also look at things like development corporations, which Laurie Hancock has said on the podcast before, that are sort of evidence that when you need something to actually happen, the only way to do it in the planning system is to kind of circumvent the planning system.
I can make the same point in the Panorama paper about new towns. Okay, so we've got this problem, and the way that we can unlock this problem is by just having a completely different system. And it's like, well, if that tells you something, then maybe we want to do it on a more generalised... we want to do it beyond just 12 sites where we've decided are super important for some reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I guess it's a governance thing, but it's also a typology thing. I mean, and do we think that because setting a strategy for building heights, for density, works for town centers, perhaps, for allocated sites, but so much of this country is like just terraces of houses. To change the height of a terrace is just the big undertaking in terms of like land assembly and getting over the kind of cultural sensibilities that we have around terrace homes.
Terraces are kind of like a blessing and a curse in that they're like the densest type of housing, like house, where someone has a house and a garden that you can find in the world. But they're also like a cap. They only can become so dense, and they only become equivalent density to low-rise apartments when they lose the features that we kind of want in houses, which is they lose their gardens, they become back-to-back, they lose their size, they're small. And we discussed this a bit in the density paper that we just put out, which is like some bits of the urban form are easy to change and some of them are not. I think there are opportunities for trained terrace houses that should be thought about as well, because you can do it. And I think because the UK is in a bit of a sticky situation in that it has this weirdly housing dominant thing, my approach as a planner would probably be spaghetti. Throw many options at the wall and see what sticks.
Speaking of which, I think we need to give an honourable mention to London's density matrix, which is no longer with us.
R.I.P.
R.I.P. Yeah, R.I.P. But Aaron, do you have any thoughts on London's attempt at a density matrix?
So there was a density matrix in the 2016 revised 2017 London plan, right? And that is, I think, a fair-hearted attempt to create some kind of relationship between how urban the area is, how well connected to transport it is, and then what the densities could look like. The trouble with it was that, especially on maybe a medium town centre site, the numbers in the matrix turned out to be very crude, I think, relative to what is realistically achievable on a site. Personally, being a fan of a lot of city typologies that have variation in the roofline. And Clerkenwell is a perfect example as well, by the way. You know, you have a 3-story building, then a 5-story building, then a 6-story building, then a 3-story building. And no one, I think, has fallen ill from that. So I think that it's well intended. It also ended up operating as a discretionary sort of tool in any case. So what I would like to see in the new London plan is just a genuine floor on quibbling about height. You know, if the London plan could be so brave as to say, it doesn't matter that it's next to a 2-story building, 6 stories is acceptable in P-tiles 4 through 6. I would love that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the way that we have to talk about what planning reforms would be possible in the UK given our start point. Because, I mean, like looking at the French, German, and Japanese, they're all like really different and they've all evolved from where they are. And they all do have a strong they strongly determine the way that the cities look. And like I think I like the French system because it has lots of that upfront discretion built into it, which means it can be quite sensitive and very proactive, but also quite micromanagey. If you want to be a planner, you probably want to live in France, not Japan. But our system of local planning is so eroded that, and like the number of people any given planning team has working on policy as opposed to development management is so small that you have to kind of look at the UK and think about the way its planning system might evolve and go, unfortunately, we are 40 years on capacity and capability away from ever being able to manage ourselves like the French system. We can hold it there maybe as like a goal, but we probably need to take a bit more of a kind of, if we're going to achieve as much as we need to achieve, something a bit more like what you just described, which is a bit more like what Japan would do, which is to go, this place has this kind of characteristics. That broadly makes sense. It's administratively not too burdensome to make some definitive rules that can then be like yes or no. And I think that's probably where you're going to have to get to. You will have a 6-story building being next to a 2-story building and people will be like, what? So, but that is a more probably realistic way for the UK system to progress, given its start point of very low public planning capacity and no systematic way of introducing rules.
We will be right back. And I mentioned Clerkenwell a bit ago, and I think it's just worth driving home that point, that when the neighborhood comes up in conversation, people don't say, oh, I can't stand that sawtooth hellscape. People say, oh, Clerkenwell, that's nice, isn't it?
I think the UK system, and this is where I begin to be a sort of academic historian overreach on my knowledge, but I think it's like the UK system was built for a system where you had mass council house building and you were doing anti-urban development, if that makes sense. You had a program of new towns and expansions of small places. You were not expecting your cities to return to being, as they are now, the centre of the economy. So, first half of the 20th century, you have cities as places of lots of industrial activity, as well as lots of other sort of skills-based commerce. Then you have industrial decline. And then everybody's like, okay, well, this is bad. And everybody needs to go to do sort of light industry in Crawley. And everybody starts working in offices. People like working in offices that are next to each other. And the most productive jobs and more people and more, for a variety of reasons, all want to live together again in cities. Obviously, that's a massive overgeneralization. But the UK system is built for a system where you had much stronger local authorities, so they had much more control over their local finances. They made up a much bigger part of the state, in effect. And council house building was expected to make up a third to a half of all building that was going on. And they also had stronger powers over what land they could buy for what price. And so in a system where you're expecting the state to do lots of stuff, and then you're expecting that stuff to happen on places which are new, so mostly greenfield development, the system worked. But then you've had all of those things change in that you've had people want to return to cities. We've got a completely residualized local government system. The system would always have found it difficult to have been as proactive as it was, save for being entirely state-led, as like a lot of urban house building was. If you go back to another of our papers looking at the history of public house building and seeing the percentage of houses built in central Manchester that were built by the state, it was like 80-90% through the post-war period. Save for the state returning to that level of, even then they weren't hitting the level of house building that a mixed market does in Lyon today, for example.
Damn.
Our system isn't set up to well manage the changing of places which already have houses in them and a system which doesn't have a strong state. And so we need to fix both of those things if we're to improve, I guess, is where I get to on that. I suppose if I was to make a commentary around what the current government is doing, they're not doing enough to change the way that our system expects new building to occur. And they are not changing the role of local government so much. They're just changing the parameters for local government in terms of what it will permit. And they will be successful in encouraging more greenfield development through the changes that they've done. When it comes to building in cities, they're finding it much more difficult. I think if they're going to find it easier, they need to fix one at least of those things that I've spoken about, but probably both.
Do you see the provisions of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill or the other more secondary minor legislation that's been tabled to likely address those points?
I think certainly on the kind of strategic level planning stuff, that's going to be like, London might not be the best planned city in the world, but it's probably doing a better job of managing housing allocation across places than either Manchester or Birmingham or Liverpool are able to for their lack of strategic plans. That is a way of planning transport and housing together and thinking a bit more long term is definitely a welcome addition. Whether or not you need to achieve at least housing kind of goals, like strategic level plans versus the status quo, unclear. And you could make a criticism that they've put more time into having sort of the same system exist everywhere than they should have done, where it would have been better to have focused more on where are the real constraints here, and is there a way that we can size through those more quickly. And then, I guess on the kind of public interaction with land and development management, at least in my analysis, the key thing that was done was the changes in the Levelling Up Act 2023, which give the state an ability to buy land at existing use value in particular public interest circumstances. And what the Planning Infrastructure Bill does is make amendments to make that more operable. So any given instance of that doesn't need to go via the Secretary of State, but it can be signed off at a lower level. But we're still waiting on a kind of TBC, whether or not who's going to take on the challenge of taking that through the courts to set a precedent before it would be used more widely.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that hasn't happened speaks to this broader thing, which is, okay, so you've now got a system where the state could, in theory, go around buying more land than it was in the past. But have you fixed the other thing that you need to have that happen, which is more lawyers in local authorities who have the skills and experience to then go and do that? I haven't seen enough on that. So just because the rules say you can doesn't mean you will. And I think that's where that bit of it is maybe not going to achieve as much as the people who've been pushing it and getting those changes through hope it might.
You mentioned earlier the way that local governments have had fairly large parts of their sort of independence and agency removed through successive reforms. And from our planning perspective, I think it's fair to say that we often see the effects of the local authority not having an incentive to achieve the minimum housing requirements, which plays into the structural problem with the discretionary system in it being reactionary, right? The status quo is sort of structured to be, by default, a better option than anything that isn't perfect. And I think when we talk about incentive structures for local government, and we look at the ways that their funding is so severely constrained, which is not only a capacity issue, but it's a morality issue, right? It's a motivation issue. Is there a solution, i.e. money, that could be implemented in a straightforward way, where there could be sort of like a fire in the eyes of officers or the planning department to be reignited in a way?
Yeah. So there's multiple layers to this. There's kind of like the development related, so development contributions and how that system does or does not incentivize local authorities to behave in a particular way. And then you've got local government finance more generally and the knock-on impact that can have on both capacity and incentive to plan. So if you take the second one, that's what we focused on in the Panorama paper, where you make the observation that in the 3 other countries, local government, they take a higher proportion of the total tax take in the country generally, as opposed to 95% of UK tax is collected at a national level, and then some of that's redistributed out to local level in the UK, whereas the local level tax base is larger in France, Germany and Japan. And then also you look at the control over the sources and then the diversity of sources available to local government, which gives them 2 things. One is an ability to sort of plan and respond to different situations which might happen to them. Say a big business has gone bust in your local area. You're completely dependent on what national government might do to respond to that. Whereas if you have a few more different taxes and levers, you're going to be in some ways more exposed to some of those, more in the driving seat as the local authority to be actually planning what's going on in your local area. And then I guess then there's the incentives, which relates to those sources, but also the relationship between that and whatever national level top-up system you have. So in the UK, broadly, it's a bit of a simplification, but if you grow your council tax base and you add houses, and your grant will then go down. And so you end up with the same per capita amount of money. And that's obviously a redistributive. That means that if a place is getting richer, it will not be massively advantaged over a place which is struggling. And from the point of view of a place which is struggling, you can understand why that system would have been put in place. And all 4 countries that we looked at have a way of redistributing. Some places are always poorer, so their property taxes are going to be lower, and so they're always going to need top up to provide the basic services which national government has asked local government to say, this is your role. But in all 3 of the other countries, they have different mechanisms by which, if you grow your tax base, you see returns to that. The Japanese do it in the most straightforwardly diagramizable way, which you can see in the appendix if you want. Basically, a local authority knows that it will keep at least 25% of its gains. The rest of it goes into a redistributive pot, some of which it might see back and some of it wouldn't. And that just means that a local authority goes, I know if I continue to grow, I benefit. And in terms of sort of incentives to local authorities to get on board with national level agenda on economic growth, that changes the way that they might think. And then I guess if you think about development contributions, I don't know what I think about this. I haven't done enough work to know what I think the answer to the UK system is, because we simultaneously have, so Section 106 is kind of the system which has extracted most value from the development process as any system that we've ever had. So if you think about land value capture and your aim is to maximize it, and you counted up the value of all of the affordable houses that we deliver through Section 106 agreement, it's like quite big. I've done some modelling which says it's nowhere near as big as it could be, but it's also not doing a bad job of delivering some of the things that we want it to deliver. But you could also make the observation that we've become way too dependent on Section 106 being affordable housing. There are quantitative and geographical limits to where and how much affordable housing you would ever be able to deliver through any kind of land value capture mechanism. In places where houses don't sell for very much money, you can't get very much. On greenfield sites, you can get more. And in the southeast, you could ultimately have a system where 90% of the dwellings were of some kind of affordable houses, and the selling market dwellings would cross-subsidize that if landowners were willing to accept a much lower price for their land.
Is the point there that
the point
for previously developed land with a high existing use value, you're not going to be able to acquire that land at a price that would then also just let you see land value capture because
certainly.
the value created by the development is just paying for the land.
Yeah, so in your maximal Section 106 world, you end up delivering more affordable housings on the edge of cities. And if you're completely dependent on it and you don't deliver anywhere near as much inside of cities, London's a bit of an exception because housing here is so expensive. So I guess you're kind of caught with Section 106 because it delivers lots of stuff that we want. For as long as we don't have any other way of delivering that stuff that we want, for as long as the affordable housing grant is sort of completely insufficient, then fine. That's kind of like the reasons that we've got to where we're at. But also it's case by case, and that comes with lots of backwards and forwards, which again creates jobs for consultants and lawyers rather than having a more streamlined system. You could have a development tax, which would collect money into a pot, which could then be spent on whatever. I think there's also a thing with Section 106 where stuff ends up funding affordable housing more than it funds other public goods, which people want when they see development, like improvements to infrastructure or whatever. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is on that and how that ties up with how local authorities can work.
And I'm also thinking about it in the context of the authority where I live, Tower Hamlets, which has insane wealth, me in the middle. I mean, above the middle, but like to be perfectly fair, and then a lot of deprivation. If an authority like Tower Hamlets, where there is a socioeconomic mix, and it's also one of like the most extreme sort of mixtures, I think, in England, if there were a way to have an additional levy, so you've got your council tax, it's based on the sort of poorly calculated value of your property, but then they had a separate tax based on, say, household income that said, we're going to build affordable housing with this money tax.
Yeah. Well, I guess so. I mean, one of the things that we advocate as Central Cities is more fiscal devolution, and that's what that's what that means.
It's a much better term than my really long explanation.
Yeah. Well, it's just because at the moment, everybody in Tower Hamlets is being taxed on their income. It's just all of that money then is being collected by HMRC as opposed to by Tower Hamlets. Yeah. And it's a question as to whether or not Tower Hamlets should receive a percentage of the income tax that's collected in Tower Hamlets, or it should receive through the grant system, it receives a percentage of income tax that's collected in the UK, if that makes sense. So it's like that would be an incentive for it to grow its tax base, not without potentially perverse, anti-poor type or anti-people who are earning no income incentives for local authorities if they were receiving a proportion of income tax. But, broadly, and then is the local authority the correct geography to have a subnational income tax being collected? We've proposed in the past that income tax retention should go to cities rather than to local authorities on the basis that the local economy, like Tower Hamlets, is not in the control of the income of its residents. The London mayor is much more in control of levers that affect the prosperity of London, and therefore it would make more sense for the mayor to be incentivised to be growing his income tax base, and if that makes sense. And then the mayor can have various policies, including topping up their affordable housing policy as a result of collecting that money.
No, that does make sense. And
it gets a level of complicated because if London kept 10% of its income tax and Manchester kept 10% of its income tax, the amount that Manchester would receive would be really small. London is responsible for 25% of the UK's total income tax. So 10% of that would be quite a lot less money for everything else. And the way that would have to start to become part of the system would be London would receive like 2 or 3% of its overall income tax. You could have up to 10, 15, 20% of Manchester's take being collected by Manchester. And then you're in a situation where both mayors are equipped a similar boost to their incentives and their money pots. But the national level exchequer is not sort of seriously changed in the same way that if you had the same percentage everywhere in London. Keeping all the money for itself.
And this is the problem with taxes, isn't it? It's that you can slice it in a million different ways, and there's going to be these sort of unaccounted for consequences, perverse incentives.
But what would be, just to summarize it, what would be the advantage of a fiscally devolved system?
So I guess at the moment you have the Manchester mayor and the London mayor, their budget is given to them by national government. And so if you believe that devolution, the principles of it, which are, politicians who are close to the ground, they understand their area, they're likely to make better decisions because they understand what's going on, as opposed to Whitehall, which is far away from most places and detached from the machinations of whatever local government or local things are happening. If you believe in that kind of principle, what we have in the UK is not really that, because you haven't got what those local politicians and their bureaucracies are able to do being in their control completely, because all of their purse strings are still held by the national level government. So we have a system of delegation more than we have devolution in this country. Local government is a system for national government to achieve its goals, and politicians who are elected to local government have very little power. A mayor of Bordeaux has way more power than the mayor of Bristol because they have so much more control over the property tax in that area. And the mayor of Bordeaux will still be saying, please give me more powers to retain my income tax, because he also doesn't have income tax, but they can decide the percentage rate on their property tax in a way that, Bristol mayor doesn't even get council tax. They just get the grant from central government.
It makes sense in theory. I can't help but think of, you'll remember from your time at LSE, Andres Rodriguez-Posay.
Yeah.
His research on the economic benefits of devolution, fiscal devolution.
What his research mostly was talking about sort of unfunded mandates. Like the worst thing to do is for the central government to empower local people by saying, you're now in control of this, and then you give them no money, and of course they can't do that thing. And that will then end up being worse than that central level bureaucrat doing the thing when they had the money to do so. What I think, I don't know if Andres would agree with my summary of his analysis is broadly that devolution can be good and it can be bad, and it depends how you do it. And if you do it with unfunded mandates, it'll probably be bad. And if you do it where you have a mismatch of fiscal powers and responsibilities, or you don't have fiscal control along with those responsibilities, you don't see as many benefits. And then there's the capacity side of things, which is even if you gave them the money and you gave them the powers, but then no one was skilled enough to do it, then that's also not going to work as well. And so depending on the level of development of your country, I think a lot of the stuff that we would have studied as part of that was looking at examples in Colombia or in sort of middle income countries which are trying to move from a state of small centralized state to developed economy. The amount of times I think about the way that the UK functions and goes, we're behind or not at all dissimilar to the way that those countries are working in terms of the functionality of local government, is why we don't feel too bad about saying we should do more devolution, because we have so little of it.
I think that's really good food for thought and an important point, and probably a good place to end. But Maurice Lange of Centre for Cities, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow, and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Additional production by my colleague and co-host, Alex Roth. Marketing and promotion by our colleague, Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague, Mariam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.